R AskReddit. What's a mystery you can't believe is still unsolved? Brandon Swanson. He was on the phone with his father late one night after a car accident, said oh shit and was never heard from again. Pretty sure the prevailing theory is he fell and died in that field and then was unfortunately ground up by large farming equipment because they didn't see him. Bodies don't just pulverize into dust, though. If that had happened, evidence of that would have been found. I think the theory is rather that he was asleep unconscious and was killed by the farming equipment and more or less disposed of. This theory is supported by the fact that some farmers in the area have always refused to let police investigate their farm's equipment to help the search. Edit. I am indeed not knowledgeable at all on how farming works, especially in the US where farmland is usually way bigger than what we have in Europe. I also have no idea of what kind of relationship exists between farmers and law enforcement in the US. Most of all, I don't think that farmers are criminals going around killing people, even accidentally. I am simply saying that this is the most common theory, because it would explain the absence of the body. I don't know if this is what actually happened, it just makes the most sense to me. I could certainly be wrong. And truly, all that matters in this case is the suffering of Brandon and his family, and the hope we can someday give him a proper burial, and bring closure to his family. I just read a story about this happening with a guy at a ski resort. He fell and broke some bones on a hillside. Worker didn't see him then and drove over him, but didn't kill him. Whatever vehicle the worker was driving was designed to shred glacier ice to make snow all year round, so his body was pretty chopped up. The worker panicked, tied the guy up, then threw him, still alive, into a crack in the glacier. His body wasn't found for years, but his parents traveled from another continent. They never stopped looking until the body was found accidentally. Edit. His name was Duncan McPherson and this happened in the late 80s. There were no cell phones and nobody even knew what country he was visiting, just that he was in Europe. His parents did find out he went missing at that ski resort after going through several countries showing photos asking if anyone had seen him. They just happened to run into his ski instructor from the resort and he told them that Duncan just never showed up for his next lesson, but that's all he knew. It wasn't unusual for tourists to leave suddenly, so he didn't question it. Once authorities knew where I went missing, they did search the glacier but didn't find the body because the crack he was thrown in had since refilled. He was buried there for 13 years until later a worker saw his jacket poking out of the ice. The worker who drove over him and ditched him in the crack was never identified. Edit 2. Some people commented suggesting he may have died by just falling. Here is a link to a report on his body with photos, including the multiple amputations from the machinery as well as his clothing that had been cut. Amber Hageman. She was about my same age and was killed in the city where I grew up. The Amber Alert system in the US was named in her honor and has helped safely recover many abducted children. However, Amber's murderer was never found and the tip hotline for her case remains open. We had a woman go missing in Denton nearly 30 years ago. She made a phone call from a payphone at a convenience store for someone to come pick her up and she just disappeared. I was convinced her remains were in the drainage ditch near the store and got washed away with the rain. That ditch became a river as a form of flood control. A few years ago a man confessed to her murder and led investigators to where he buried her body. This is because DNA evidence linked him to another murder committed that year. No doubt he's leading them to bodies in an attempt to either get a favorable sentence or to postpone an execution. I'm not familiar with the Hageman case besides the Amber Alert aspect of it, but I hope they got DNA evidence to maybe figure out who the killer was. Here's a link to the story about the missing woman in Denton and other murders from that year. Who knows how many women this guy killed? At least 3 in 1997 alone. Why does no one just make the game that every ad for the game claims to be? This is something I ponder every day. Like, just make it an actual game and you will get millions of downloads. Where did Epstein's videos go? Who has them and who is on them? He supposedly filmed the rich and powerful raping children. There's a lot of sick fucks that need to be exposed and held accountable for what they've done. The rich and powerful had that evidence destroyed pretty obviously. World's most famous human trafficker, trafficked to absolutely nobody. The murder of Elizabeth Barazza. It was caught on camera and the getaway vehicle was clearly seen. The murderer was speculated as being a woman or man in a wig. Truly bizarre. Truly unfortunate the camera angles are so close to revealing their identity by like Missy M's and no cigar. Really don't understand the motive. Where the fuck is Shelly Miscavige? Tony Ortega is a journalist who runs the website The Underground Bunker. He is an expert in Scientology and has devoted much of his professional life to reporting on it. I have followed him for years and consider his credentials impeccable. He said that, according to a contact who works within the organization, Shelly is near Lake Arrowhead. Scientology has a compound up there, called something like the Division of Spiritual Technology. That's the group in charge of inscribing Hubbard's words onto titanium plates and burying by them in the desert for future generations. It's very isolated. She's up there and handled quite closely. And I believe that's where the police made contact with her. Not at all suggesting that it's voluntary or even that she's safe, but that was her last reported location. Ortega also talked about the circumstances of her disappearance. Apparently, David was out of town, and Shelly took the opportunity to assign workers to projects that David was dragging his feet on. He was outraged by her temerity when he returned, and he had her banished. Yeah, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. The only thing I would add is that the Argonne facility where they inscribe the plates and store them seems to be where they send people who are too powerful within the cult to be declared an SP and could challenge David's power. He sets them up with a nice, cushy prestigious job way out in the middle of nowhere. It's worth remembering we only know who Shelly is in the first place because she was his assistant and thus photographed with him often, not because she was his wife. There are many victims of Scientology we never hear about. I don't believe anybody at that facility is being held against their will, in contrast to the whole or RPF, if that's still a thing. It's much more likely a peer pressure type thing keeping them there. That is, do you want to be the Scientologist who says no when given the opportunity to preserve LRH's writing for future generations? As a native of the Portland, Oregon metro area, it's really sad that Kyron Horman's disappearance is still unsolved. He will be 21 this year. Disappeared at 7. I remember this one. His stepmom definitely got rid of him one way or another. There's so much pointing towards it, but they can't prove it without a reasonable doubt. She made sure she took pictures of him at the school that morning to prove he was there, went out to multiple places with her infant daughter even though the baby was supposedly inconsolable because of an ear infection. Like, nobody is taking a crying, miserable baby with them to the gym. Bitch was creating an alibi. People had reported seeing an unfamiliar man in her car with her that same day, right outside the school. Her gardener reported her to the police because months prior she had tried to hire him to kill her husband. Her best friend left work suddenly shortly after Kyron would have gone missing and purchased the stepmom a prepaid cell phone. The stepmom repeatedly refuses to answer even a single question regarding the case, even refusing to acknowledge that she recognizes Kyron in pictures. It's terrible. I really hope his father gets some sort of resolution one day. I remember this one. His stepmom definitely got rid of him one way or another. There's so much pointing towards it, but they can't prove it without a reasonable doubt. Just to offer an alternative opinion, I actually don't think she had anything to do with it. I think she was a shitty wife, but not a murderer. I also remember the asking the gardener to kill the husband thing being a load of rubbish. I was interested in reading more about it when people were non-stop discussing it way back when, and the timeline never made sense to me for her to have actually killed him. She didn't drop him off at school then go off for the day. She went to various locations, got receipts, was seen on CCTV etc. He's never seen with her. Here's a timeline, copied from another comment. 8:50 car, driving from school. 9 o'clock car, 10-minute driving time. Arrives at Fred Meyer at Embry Drive, looking for medicine for her daughter but not finding it. 9:12 gets a receipt for coffee at the Starbucks at that same Fred Meyer. 9:30 car, 10-minute driving time. Arrives at Fred Meyer at Walker Road, goes into the store, finds medicine, chats with an acquaintance, then drops of a couple of shirts at a dry cleaners. 10 o'clock car, leaves the Fred Meyer, drives to a Michael's Craft store. Car 5 minutes away. 10:10 to 10:15 car, leaves Michael's, gives her daughter the medicine, sits for about half an hour trying to get her to sleep before driving up to Highway 30 to let the motion of the car soothe her. I'm sure there's more to that timeline, but I know it's pretty concrete and there's such a small window she'd have to commit the murder that it seems far-fetched. Either it's the most pre-planned murder ever and she got insanely lucky not being seen with him and was able to cover up all evidence within an hour or so, I think less, or it was accidental. Which is even more unlikely. If you believe she's guilty, then you can make all of that seem suspicious. Like you said, who runs errands with a baby that has an ear infection? A lot of people seem to get hung up on that while ignoring how tight her timelines was. To me it seemed unlikely she'd go to all of these locations, and right in the middle of them possibly murder her stepson, while never being seen with him. Not by witnesses, not on CCTV. The man in the car you mentioned isn't true either. It's commonly repeated, but there wasn't witnesses who said they saw a man in her truck. There were witnesses who said they saw Kyron talking to a man in a truck. It was falsely reported as Terry's truck because both were white. That man could have been a random man, or an accomplice of the stepmothers if you believe she's guilty, but they weren't in a truck together. Before we go further, please press the red subscribe button below if you're enjoying this so far. Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum Art Heist, 1990. And they still have the empty frame up from the Rembrandt that was stolen. And little plaques where I believe some drawings from Degas were stolen as well. It was pretty cool to see. The heist becomes part of the museum. They have all of the frames up. Gardner willed that after her death, no changes could be made to the museum, and that if anything was changed the entire collection was to be packed up and auctioned in Europe, with all proceeds going to Harvard's trust. It was decided that the theft didn't violate her will, but that the frames left behind needed to be rehung in their original locations in order to stay within the terms. The Sitaguer family murder, in which the Miyazawa family were murdered in their home in December 2000. The killer was confident, having left fingerprints and DNA evidence, as well as the clothes he was wearing, in the house. Sand was analyzed from the scene, and had sand from Edwards Air Force Base in California. Not only that, only 120 sweaters of the kind the killer was wearing were sold. Somehow, still not solved. John Bennett Ramsey. The ransom note, to me, makes it so the only suspects are family members. That thing is just so long, so filled with movie-like details, and so specific with John's bonus. Plus it looks like Patsy's handwriting. Even so, I can't think of any theory that makes total sense. If Burke did it on accident, why'd they send him to the neighbors since he could have let something slip? If John did it, would Patsy really help him cover it up? And if Patsy did it, how'd John seem to know right where the body was? The ransom note, to me, makes it so the only suspects are family members. I also think it's likely a family member, but only because it's the most generic explanation. I do think if the family were not as wealthy and high status, people wouldn't be arguing lots of random theories, and the parents would have instantly been suspects. I always assumed it was the dad, but really an argument could be made for anyone in the house. I think there's less explanation for the son though. The note being in the mother's handwriting could point to her, but I prefer the theory it was him copying her writing to disguise his own. The note completely revolved around him as well, but neither of those things really matter much. The one theory I read that made sense to me was that the father had been abusing her and killed her. The note was meant to be taken seriously by his wife, so that while she waited and followed instructions to not call police, he'd have time to remove her body from the basement and pack it into the empty suitcase they found that was out. She called the police immediately instead, and he had to find the body during the search. Alternatively, it was the mother, or son, or a random stranger with the weirdest murder plan ever. It is a sad and strange case. When I was a kid, over the course of like 10 years, a bunch of severed feet washed up upon the shores of Vancouver Island. It was almost always 1 foot, in a shoe, like 3-5 years apart. Super odd. Edit. Since August 2007, 20 different feet have been recovered in the Salish Sea region alone. This is kind of solved? From what I remember, they determined that due to water currents the feet were from people who had jumped to commit suicide. Your ankle is a weak part of your body and shoes float, so it's easy for a foot to break off of an ankle after a short time decomposing and then float away somewhere. From what I read, the show floating theory was disproven as way too unlikely. The amount of disembodied feet that float is very small, yet there's an insanely high amount of disembodied feet. Jack the Ripper's identity. Victorian London's most famous killer. Inspires countless stories and fascination. Women brutally murdered. Lots of apparent evidence. And despite all this, no one can say for sure or even largely agree who he is. I work near Whitechapel too. Crazy the history there. Lemino's documentary about it is great. Still can't believe so many of those records have survived. It's pretty insane that nobody ever found out who it was though. I wonder how many other criminals just slipped past the authorities in the past due to the lack of DNA testing and shit. My personal theory is a dude named Dr. Francis Tumblety. He was an American medical quack that bounced around a lot. He even lived in my hometown of Hamilton, Ontario at one point, which would explain the murder of 2 prostitutes who had their throats slashed here before the Ripper murders took place. Some evidence Tumblety could be the Ripper. He matched the description. He had thick mustaches and a gentlemanly demeanor. Some describe the Ripper as speaking with a foreign accent, which, being American, Tumblety would. He was formerly a surgeon and knew about human anatomy. He had human uteri on display in jars in his home. Jack the Ripper was known for removing the uteri of his victims. He was very good at evading police. He was investigated multiple times for fraud and each time he kinda disappeared and relocated. He had a vendetta against prostitutes and was a known misogynist, because his former wife had been a prostitute and divorced him. He was living in Whitechapel at the time of the Ripper murders. Friends of Tumblety, people who knew him, said they would not be the least bit surprised if he was the Ripper. He apparently vanished when police came to question him about the Ripper killings. Likely just moved again. The only evidence they have that makes people say it isn't him is that he was too tall. I'm no detective. I'm not even an armchair detective, but I'd put my money on that guy. It's nothing wildly infamous, but when I got my cat, I bought him a catnip cookie toy. He'd play with that thing for hours at a time. One day, it disappeared. We've rearranged the rooms multiple times since then and it's nowhere to be found. I know, it's probably not what you're looking for, but it's the biggest unsolved mystery I know. Sneer Philip, the doctor who was last seen shopping at a store near her Lower Manhattan apartment the evening of the 10th of September, 2001, but never returned home that night. Obviously, we all know what happened the next morning. Her husband and family hired a private detective and fought to have a review of her case done for several years before she was officially named a 9/11 victim, even though there is no solid evidence to prove she was at or in the WTC at the time either plane struck or when the towers collapsed. But there's also no solid evidence to prove she wasn't at the WTC either. It's so crazy. In a nutshell, there are about 4 or 5 theories on what happened to her and all of them are evenly plausible. This reminds me of a post-secret that I saw years ago that said something along the lines of I faked my death on 9/11. A bit off the cuff, but the Kokolitsli epidemics. This illness broke in Central America after Europeans made contact in the 16th century, and it destroyed entire villages. One epidemic killed 10-12 million people, even more than smallpox in the area. Absolute desolation. No one knows what illness it was. Was it a hantavirus? Smallpox? Salmonella? Viral hemorrhagic fever? Why did it always appear after a drought? Where did it go? We will probably never know. My favorite podcast, This Podcast Will Kill You, did an episode on Kokolitsli, going into detail about contact and colonization and how and why there isn't much historical record on this. For those who don't like to sleep at night, I like the idea, insofar as you can like anything about an epidemic, that it was something so innocuous to Europeans that we don't even have a name for it. Maybe it swept through Europe 6,000 years ago and killed millions, but the survivors were left with enough immunity that it became nothing worse than the common cold. Then it got carried to a new population that had zero resistance and went nuts again. The girl I knew who disappeared without a trace in 1989, when we were 12-13 years old. She was a good kid, not the type to run away or anything, most likely was abducted and murdered by the same couple who killed a few other girls in the area around that time. She was walking home from school, and her keys were found later near a wooded area, then her backpack was found in a nearby creek. Thanks for watching. Please press the like button if you enjoyed and the notification bell next to the subscribe button to never miss another video. Let me know your thoughts below. Bye.